How the Light Gets In is the Institute of Art and Ideas' unique festival, combining days full of talks and debates in philosophy, politics, arts and science, with evenings full of music and dance. Get your tickets for the world's largest music and philosophy festival at howthelightgetsin.org.
Yeah, so how does a guy who wrote a book on irregular verbs come to write a book on Enlightenment, reason, science, humanism, progress? It sprang from an obsession with human nature. I argued in a book called The Blank Slate, another philosophical issue, that there is such a thing as human nature, that it is shaped by evolution, implemented in the wiring of the brain by our genome. And I examined why that very concept of human nature, as opposed to the idea that we are blank slates that are simply written on by society and culture, why is the blank slate so appealing, emotionally, politically, morally? And I argue that one of the reasons that people resist the idea that we are evolved creatures, that we have a human nature, is that it seems to many people to dash any hope for social improvement. The fear is that if there's such a thing as human nature, you can just dismiss attempts to reduce violence, to reduce greed, to reduce discrimination by saying, oh, it's just human nature, you'll never get rid of war, because humans are inherently warlike. That leads people to say, well, there better not be any human nature or else we're going to be at each other's throats for all eternity. One of the points I made in the Blank Slate, just in passing, was that's a non sequitur. The fact that human nature exists doesn't mean that we have to behave in the same way in perpetuity, because human nature is complex. It does have some nasty bits. There is such a thing as lust and selfishness and revenge and dominance, but we also are equipped by evolution with self-control, with empathy, with reason, with moral norms, and it's a question of how the balance between those different parts of human nature plays out in a given time and place that determines how we actually behave. And I noted almost in passing that there can't really be a debate as to whether human nature dooms us to a constant level of strife, because we just know, looking at history, that there have been beneficial changes. Slavery was abolished. The Soviet Empire collapsed with very little violence. And I noted the rate of homicide had gone down in Europe since the Middle Ages. Well, when I repeated these observations in a blog post, I started to get correspondence from scholars in various disciplines all over the world saying, oh, you could have added even more examples of how violence has declined. Did you know that rates of death in war have come down over the last 70 years? Did you know that violence against women has decreased? Did you know that every European country saw a drastic drop in rates of interpersonal violence? And I realized there's a big story here that very few people are aware of, that on many scales of time and magnitude, violence has been in decline over the course of history. So not being a professional historian or political scientist, I realized that still I was privy to all of these sources of data from different disciplines that deserved to be put in one place. So I wrote a book called The Better Angels of Our Nature, stealing the term from Abraham Lincoln.
But as a psychologist, this decline of violence also posed the challenge to me of explaining how it happened. Why were people so violent in the past? How did they manage to tame this violence? Two psychological questions. Once I started to be open to data on the course of human history, then I started to come across other data sets showing that it wasn't just in the case of violence that we've made human life better, but we also live longer, we are better educated, more of us live in democracies, we have more leisure time. In measure after measure, if you remove yourself from the headlines and look at the data, you see vast human improvement. Poverty has been decimated worldwide, and I thought this needed a book as well, extending the lesson about improvement in peacefulness to improvement in other measures of human flourishing, and once again the challenge of explaining it. Where our human nature hasn't changed in the last couple of centuries, how do we manage to improve human life? There, I think ideas matter, and one of the key ideas that, or sets of ideas that led to human improvement were the ideas that we associate with the Enlightenment, the use of reason to figure out the world as opposed to dogma or faith or authority. The attempt to understand the physical world by applying reason to it, what we call science. The ideal of humanism, that what counts morally is suffering and flourishing of sentient creatures, including humans, and that those ideas, when implemented, were what eked out the progress that you could see in the graphs.
Mm-hmm. How do you respond to criticisms to your book that talk about the fact that life has only improved for certain groups of people and not for others?
Oh, it's false. The whole point of the book is life has improved across the world. Global poverty has declined from 90% of the world's population to 10% of the world's population. Proportion of people living in democracies has risen from 1% to about 2/3. Entire regions of the world that were at war are now in peace. Literacy has improved not just in rich countries, but in poor countries. The whole point of the book is that this is not a development that's confined to the rich or to the West. So anyone making that criticism has not opened the book.
And yet we have populism and Trump and neo-fascism rising. Does that have anything to do with the fact that we're also embracing Enlightenment values at all, or is that something that is totally outside this realm?
There's ever since the Enlightenment unfolded, there have been counter-Enlightenment philosophies that have opposed it. And the Enlightenment by no means has won the day in all periods, and it right now is the latest wave of pushback against Enlightenment ideas. The movements of populism and fascism light and nationalism downplay the individual. They prioritize the glory of the nation or the tribe or the race. They downplay a reason, saying, oh, that's just what experts believe, and instead go with the sentiment of the people conceived of as a tribe or a unitary polity, rather than
the worked out procedures and laws of democracy. They seek to empower a charismatic leader who embodies the soul of the people directly. So this is the latest pushback. It's not the first, and I certainly hope it will be less successful than previous counter-Enlightenment movements like the fascism and nationalism in the first half of the 20th century.
I'm really interested in the way you created a kind of dichotomy between the celebration of the individual that the Enlightenment has embraced, and then this narrative of the nation or the tribe or the collective. But at the same time, you did mention empathy and I suppose care for other sentient beings. So is there a tension between the individual and the collective, and is individualism not linked to the Enlightenment at all? There are all of these categories, and I'm not sure how you place them in this scheme of the Enlightenment as you see it.
Yeah. Well, humans are social animals, and none of us can exist without a couple, a family, a community. Our happiness, our well-being very much depends on being part of a successful community, one where cooperation and harmony prevail over competition. At the same time, it's the individual who feels pain, who suffers, who flourishes. If you cut a group of people in half and put half on one side and half on the other, it's very different from cutting a person in half in terms of damage, in terms of pain, in terms of suffering. So our moral concerns should be with the individual, the entity that actually suffers or flourishes, while recognizing that the individual, part of the source of suffering and flourishing of an individual depends on the community that they belong to. And we, as a social species, we can only live in peace and harmony if we have the equivalent of a social contract, if we have institutions like democratic government, like regulated markets, like institutes of education and charity, and a court system and rule of law that are bigger than any individual, but the happiness of the individual depends on those systems working.
So would you say then that an enlightenment kind of feeling of I don't know, of fellowship, for instance, or like feeling related to other people, goes along the lines of cosmopolitanism rather than along the lines of kind of embracing local identity, or how does that tension between the local and the global get?
Yeah. Well, an important Enlightenment theme was cosmopolitanism, that each one of us is a citizen of the world, that because we're all human, we share common interests. This is not to deny the fact that we belong to multiple groups. We're humans first and foremost, but we're also Londoners or Britons or Jews or Catholics or fans of one team versus another, or users of one brand of camera equipment or another. People form various teams, tribes, clans, which is fine if they are not set in violent competition against one another, and if no one of these group memberships completely dominates the person's identity.
And would you say that that is the problem at the moment, that there are groups that are dominating over others?
There's a big problem when people think that their group can prosper only at the expense of other groups. When people forget that the benefit of joining a group is that it enhances the lives of the individuals making it up. If people think that it's good to sacrifice hundreds of thousands of young men as cannon fodder in wars of national glory, that would be an extreme case of neglecting the rights of the individual in favor of the glory of the group. And I think the best way to think of groups is as formed by tacit social contracts, not as if we actually write out a social contract, that never happened, but still the way the group should function is as something that gives to individuals what we obviously could not get if we were isolates just wandering around on our own.
Final question. So it seems like all of your latest books have kind of flowed one from another. Has Enlightenment now inspired you to write another book, and if so, what will that be?
Well, I tend actually in writing books, I tend to alternate between books that are closer to my own specialty of cognitive science, books on language, books on mind, and books on bigger themes that are that connect to human nature, like the history of violence, like Enlightenment values. My next book will combine them. Its tentative title is Don't Go There: Common Knowledge and the Science of Civility, Hypocrisy, Outrage, and Taboo, on how we get along, or and sometimes don't, by either knowing that everyone else knows something that we all know, or by keeping it to ourselves and not allowing it to be out there as common knowledge. This governs a lot of our social emotions. It governs our conventions of civility and politeness versus moral outrage and mobbing and shaming, and that there's an interesting explanation in terms of our psychology, in terms of game theory, and it too will draw both on philosophy, the philosophy of convention and common knowledge, on psychology of norms and taboos and politeness and mentalizing, trying to figure out what's going on in someone else's head, and current events in history.
Amazing. How has your experience of How the Light Gets In been so far?
So far, so good.
So far, so good.
Lines for the bathroom are too long.
Any highlights?
The highlights are just meeting so many people interested in deep issues and willing to engage in conversation about ideas that matter.
Among the public, or among the speakers as well?
Both, but perhaps most notably about the public, the fact that there can be a cultural event that attracts people who are interested in ideas is, I think, a hopeful sign. It's a lovely event.
Get your tickets for the world's largest music and philosophy festival at howthelightgetsin.org.